Hello, and thank you for joining us for this breakout session on using technology to enhance your compliance program. This is also, as well as being part of the ECEC, which I hope you're enjoying today, this is also the third in a three-part webinar series that we've been running to mark the 10th anniversary of the Bribery Act 2010 in partnership with the Forensic Risk Alliance, also known as FRA, which is a leading forensic risk consultancy. My name is Viviane Joynes. I am the Managing Director of EQS's UK business, where, as you know, we provide digital solutions, digital compliance solutions to organisations. I'm really delighted to be joined today by three expert panellists. So we have with us Trevor Wiles, a partner at FRA. We have Rasoul Golparvar, who is a director at FRA, and we have Moritz Hohmann, who is our Managing Director of Compliance Solutions, all of whom have a lot of experience with regard to compliance programs, the company's compliance programs, but also obviously technology, which is the topic of today. So thank you so much to Trevor, Raz and Moritz for joining us today for this session. So during the session, we'll be exploring how to use technology to engage employees, to make the best of the data that you have to monitor your compliance program, and even to predict the future. And obviously we can't do a session like this without talking about artificial intelligence. So that will also form part of our discussion. And we'd love to hear questions from you. So if anything comes up, anything pops into your minds as we go through, please do submit the question and we'll do our best to come to it towards the end. So now to start off our conversation. So I think when we talk about technology and compliance, there are many applications that we can think of. So if we just start by going through some of the most common uses of technology that you see at the moment. Moritz, do you want to start us off?
Yes, of course. Thank you, Viviane. So if we look at our current client base, for example, or companies having employed compliance and ethics programs in general, the use of technology that we see today is still rather basic, I would say. So many companies already use technology for the compliance program, but the way that they use it is in many parts, it's still using spreadsheets, it's using email processes, it's using SharePoint, so like general purpose software. Companies will have deployed specific software for parts of their compliance program, like for example, the training. They will have an e-learning tool. Maybe they have a policy management software installed. But in our experience, there are not many companies that have digitized it all the way through and are already have already arrived at some point where they have a unified dashboard where all the data feeds into. And the topics that we will later touch on in this session, like artificial intelligence or even robotic process automation, we don't see a big number of companies using this. We see financial institutions, and especially the financial sector, provides some areas where it makes a lot of sense to use this technology. But if you look at like the broad range of industries and the big number of companies, we don't see many of them already making use of this technology. I think they're all aware of this and they're on the journey to get there, but there are many challenges which we will also discuss today.
Great, thanks, Moritz. That's a great overview. And Trevor, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, thanks, Viviane, and delighted to be with you all today. Certainly, if I look back over the last 10 years, I've certainly seen an increase in the use of technology. And I think certainly for the larger companies, there's a lot of technology that's probably taken for granted these days. And it's some of the ones that Moritz mentioned, such as online training, whistleblower, online platforms to support telephone lines, the online policies and frequently asked questions, making those available to people, gifts and entertainment registers, conflict of interest declarations. And then there are, the banks have taken it a step further. They use technology for their transaction monitoring and their trader surveillance. We probably all know how in the past on our credit card, we always used to get loads of notifications stopping our credit cards being used, but now that technology is improved and we get far less of those as the false positives have been weeding out. But I see other areas coming more and more common, the use of dashboards, which I think is a topic we'll be discussing later. and also making compliance risk assessment and control evaluations more centralized, accessible, and consistent. And as we all know, at the heart of a good compliance program is a robust risk assessment.
Thanks, Trevor. So when we think about technology, there's obviously many different uses. And I think the first one that we wanted to touch on was how we can use technology to better engage employees in compliance-related topics. Trevor, do you want to start us off?
Yes, so on the online training, I mean, I think these short, punchy, accessible training sessions, little sort of 5-minute, 10-minute bite-sized pieces, make it more accessible to people, and employees can do it, the training as and when they like during their day. You can use notifications and banners that pop up to give you compliance reminders, help with the tone from the top, and what we call, compliance on the go, making compliance programs available through online mobile apps. So again, when you're on your train or your commuter home, you can perhaps read the latest policy that's come out, do your online training. It can send you reminders such as don't forget to complete your gifts and entertainment register for the week.
Great, thank you. And Raz?
Thank you for having me, by the way. I just started to speak. So I think it's a really good point around engaging employees, but one thing that we should certainly not forget around introducing or using technology in ABC or any other kind of compliance program is the impact that it has to essentially act as a deterrent for employees. So when you're developing detection capabilities, these are really increasing that risk of the employee getting detected or leading to prosecution, which in turn reduces employees to actually be tempted to do something wrong. So that's one really good example of a deterrent. The other one I'd also say is that actually when you are using technology, employees well, everybody will know that the systems are now testing your full set of data, as opposed to doing a bit of ad hoc or sample sets of data or looking at partial data. And so when you're looking at that full set of data, you're really, again, reducing employees' opportunities to do something wrong because you're testing it. So I think there's a knock-on effect of, employees behave differently when they know that technology is being deployed within compliance programs.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And Moritz, did you have anything to add on the engagement side?
Yeah, maybe just adding to what Trevor already mentioned, I think a big point in using technology is user friendliness and accessibility. So if you have a compliance process and we see companies having compliance processes that are just terrible from a user perspective. So for example, if you take policy management and you want to make policies available to your employees, there's a ton of different ways to do that. You can just dump all of your 200 policies on some intranet page and then leave it basically up to the employee to, if they have a specific question or if they're not sure about a certain situation, to go there to find the right policy, then find exactly the right paragraph on page 13 that maybe addresses the question that they currently have. Or you can make it more accessible. You can categorize them, you can make them easily searchable, you can train them, and technology can help you with that. And the more you think about what the actual use cases of your end user, being the regular employee who has this questions around compliance and facing these ethical dilemmas, the more you think about this perspective and how you can really make the content accessible by also using technology, the more effective your compliance program will be in the end.
Great, and actually, Raz, you were talking about the dissuasive aspect from an employee perspective and also the data that comes from that. So how, if we look at it from the other perspectives, we just talked about employees, but if we talked about the compliance teams, how does this also benefit the compliance teams when employees are engaging in that way? Moritz, do you want to kick us off?
Yes. In general, as soon as you have a process digitized, it will automatically generate data for you as a company, as a compliance and ethics professional. So if you take whistleblowing, for example, if you have a phone line, then you will have a manual task of basically logging which reports are coming in about which topic, in which country, and so on, get really data and to get insights from this data. If you have a web-based tool, this will automatically generate this data for you. So you know exactly how many reports came in which country, about which topic. And you can use this data then to generate insights and to see potential blind spots, potential risks in your compliance program. So the more processes you have digitized in ideally a way where you can also leverage the data and not build on spreadsheets and email and PDF forms, the more insights you can generate and the more proactive you can be about potential anomalies in the data.
Great. And Trevor, do you have anything to add to that?
Yes, I think where technology helps, in addition to what Marit said, is it evidences the effectiveness of your compliance program. So in simple terms, who's undertaken the online training, who's received the policies, have they confirmed that they have read the policy, on your whistleblowing, what were the types of reports that were received and how were they responded to? If that goes through an online platform, you can track that all the way through. So I think that for me is one of the key advantages of using technology.
And I think that takes us quite nicely onto KPIs, actually, having just started talking about data and how that helps monitor the compliance program. So I think understanding what to measure and putting together KPIs can be quite challenging. So Raz, what approaches have you seen companies take when it comes to embarking on this journey or even reviewing what they already have in place?
That's a really good question, and I think we're talking about technology, we're talking about data, we're talking about analytics and things. How do we look at this data? And it's not a new area as far as compliance is concerned. It's been talked about lots. Some compliance teams use it for several years now. What I think is really surprising is how underutilized technology and data and analytics is. And I think if you just look at any organization today, there's lots of data. It exists in different systems, in different formats. But I'd say almost the best approach is to forget about the data and actually start looking at the risks that the business is trying to measure. Those risks are your starting points. And that may have come out of your risk assessment exercises, maybe previous findings or audits, or even an investigation. And once you're kind of clear on the plan for the year or whatever it may be for a time period and on the risks that you're trying to measure, that's when you can actually start thinking, well, where is this data that's going to help me measure those risks? And then very quickly you start finding out, oh my God, there's quite a number of stakeholders that I need to engage to just be able to understand where this data sits, how available is it, can I actually use it, is it suitable to measure those risks? So I think that to your question about, how do they start or embark on this journey? For me, it's very much about starting with the risks you're trying to measure and then seeing where the data sits and how accessible it is. And I think perhaps just the last bit of your question around companies who are already using data in their, let's say, ABC or other compliance programs, I'd say the same steps are true. I think the review is, what risk are we trying to measure today? We may have set off trying to measure certain risks, found the data, started using it, but things have moved on. The compliance program has moved on. The data that we're using isn't fit for purpose. So it's really reassessing that simple journey of, have I got the right data? And sometimes I'll use a very good example. I was working with a client who had the perfect data to do the test they were doing, but they were limiting it to the data that they had internally in their organization, and they weren't getting the value that they wanted out of the data. And it was a simple piece of advice of saying, why not use some publicly available data like companies' registers or charities and so on. They were doing certain tests about charities, for example, and they didn't have the information in their own data sets to say whether an organization was a charity or not. With some simple data enrichment, they could now do the test and measure the risks that they wanted. So looking outside the organization for some data can help, especially for those who are already using some data. It's just trying to enrich some of their data sometimes.
And just following on from that, how can technology help bring it all together? Raz, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of key considerations here, really. I think Well, where technology can help organizations, some of those key considerations perhaps to think about is what I mentioned already, locating that data and kind of assessing the availability of that data. I think very quickly then technology can help you. So this is not about technology for doing the actual testing. It's technology to say, okay, I've now got my data. Is it complete? Is it fit for purpose? Are there any big data gaps in it or not? And technology actually acts as your friend there to even support you to go on that journey and use a certain data set. I guess aside from those, often I've seen compliance teams, use software providers who specialize in areas of providing compliance tools. And I think the key consideration around there is, again, aligning to the risks, saying, does this product or tool meet the risks that I'm trying to measure? Excuse me. And then also thinking about the requirements of some of these tools is really important, because a lot of these tools are brilliant and they can test amazing things. But if you don't have the data to let these tools do what they're meant to do, you're never going to succeed. So really testing out a tool up front before just, saying we need another tool, let's use it, etc. and so on. Probably one other key consideration I'd say is when you're thinking about using technology, and whether that's a new product or whether you're building something in-house or using your own internal analytics teams to do that, is the question around infrastructure. And that's really thinking about what's my current infrastructure today, and what's that vision, the vision that I've got for what I want to build. Does the current infrastructure, is it fit for purpose, or do I need to invest in that? And again, to my earlier point around, how quickly you realize you need help. This is where you see IT can help me with certain things, but I need the business to explain the data to me, et cetera, et cetera. So there are so many stakeholders involved when you're embarking on this journey.
Yeah, that makes sense. And you mentioned earlier about the challenge of data sitting in various different locations, different bits of software across the organization. I mean, in terms of reporting, often from a compliance perspective, it can become quite quickly a bit of a nightmare and quite manual. So how have you seen clients go about bringing the data together into something coherent that ideally creates automated reports? Trevor, I know you had some thoughts on that. Oh, I think you're on mute.
Thank you, Viviane. So one of the key aspects is understanding your data landscape. I mean, I agree with Raz that you start with your risks and then you look at your data. But as a compliance professional, I would like to believe that the organization has a good understanding of its data landscape already. So what data do they hold? Where is the data held? What is the quality of that data? Because then you can start to assess whether or not that data is going to help you meet the risks that you're looking to test. And it may well be, for example, you might want to look or do a compliance check around trade sanctions. You may find that nobody is recorded in a structured way the origin of goods. So that may be an area you need to develop in order to make that data available to you to undertake your testing. So yes, data is very important once you understand what risk you're looking to test.
Moritz, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, maybe just in addition, even if you look at the immediate compliance processes that we already talked about, like policy management, whistleblowing, and so on, the situation that we often see is that companies have different processes and use different software vendors. So they will have a manual process for the policy management. They will have one software vendor for the third-party due diligence, another one for their training or for their whistleblowing solution. And that already makes it pretty hard to get the immediate compliance data together in one overview, in one dashboard. And then there's normally two approaches how you can improve this. You can either try to move more and more solutions to one provider, basically, that already provides you this holistic view and a central dashboard, or you can try to make the data available, for which you normally need APIs to access the data, and then you would need some kind of overarching business intelligence tool like Power BI or Tableau or the likes. Both approaches come with certain effort, and you certainly need to look into which vendor are you using, do they have this flexibility, which route is basically easier for you to use. But it's definitely worth it in the end to get this overview, because otherwise, if you have a specific question about your compliance program, like how are we doing in a specific region of the world, you normally start manually collecting data, which takes a long time. And until you then have gathered the data and have come up with the conclusions you were looking for, then it might already be too late. So it's definitely worth it. There's some effort involved. But if you've done it and you have this data available, then it will be great insights for the program.
And Raz, do you have anything to add?
Yes, I mean, data sitting on different systems is probably is the biggest challenge for compliance teams. You know, we talked about risks, and when you come to that step of saying, where's the data that answers this, it's really difficult to find it. You know, just use an example, a lot of compliance teams do testing around transaction-related testing, which might be sitting in a financial or accounting system for an organization. And then when they come to review certain things that have been raised, certain transactions raised, you actually need other information like supplier or customer onboarding information, or know your client data, or perhaps even there may be some expense related data that you need. And these two data sets don't even sit on the financial system. They sit in completely different systems, and these things don't even talk to each other. So this is a critical point where compliance teams make a decision of, well, we'll just go with what we have because we have it now, we've done the transaction testing, or they start to change things. They actually invest time and learn about, you know, might learn about the other systems, and learning how can the right people help them glue these data sets together. And that's where often, I guess, I've worked with compliance teams to work on the different data sets. And you almost, as in my experience, I've sat in the middle of the compliance team and the IT team and the business team to try and say, well, in the real world, these are the things that happen. How are they captured in the data world? How's this information captured? And now how can we link these data sets together so that when you see an expense related transaction that's come up, where's the detail in describing what that expense claim is? Oh, it's in this system, and this is how we link it, and we bring that together. And then from a compliance officer or compliance reviewer's perspective, they've got all the information at hand. And that's the effort. But there is an effort. I think it seems daunting at first when you see all, and particularly today with all these large volumes of data and different data systems, it seems daunting. So my advice is, once you've gone through, you know, the example I just used, linking some transaction data to expense related data, you don't have to do it again. You've invested the effort in doing it once. You've built processes hopefully to draw that data together and link it up together. It means that next time round you're using these types of data sets and doing that type of testing. You're not investing so much time in getting the data and cleaning it and getting it ready. You're actually investing time in doing the reviews, in doing the testing, in doing the research, the investigation that needs to be done. So I think that the final point I'd say is start small, because often I've seen compliance teams have really big dreams, which is great, and they want to solve everything quickly. And I think that's the bit I'd say, stop. When you want to solve everything quickly, it doesn't work like that. Pick an area of the business, a business risk area. It might be, we talked about suppliers, so supplier risk, third-party risk, and try to see if your data is going to help you answer the tests that you need to, the risks that you're trying to measure. So it's almost basically proving to yourself and your compliance team and your organization that technology, the data, the analytics can help do this. Because once you've done that, it's so much easier to move on to another business risk area. It's so much easier to bring in other data sets. Just going through that journey once is really painful maybe at the beginning and daunting. But when you've done that, you learn so much about your own team's capability, the wider organization's capability, and how you learn from those to leverage other data sets.
Super. And actually, so now we've spoken quite a lot about the data aspect of things. So how can we then use data to identify issues, and what controls can we put in place To what extent can this be automated? Moritz, I know you had a couple of thoughts on this.
Yeah, so to again talk about the example of whistleblowing, for example, if you use a web-based reporting system and you have data available of how many reports are coming in, for example, what you will then want to look for is anomalies, basically. So if you have around the same number of reports in all of the geographic regions that you're active in, but then you realize in Eastern Europe, for example, there's a very low number of reports coming in, or even no reports coming in whatsoever, then this is normally at least a yellow flag, if not a red flag, for your compliance program. Because the easy answer would be, well, there's just no misconduct in Eastern Europe, which is normally not the answer. But it might be that the system is not just very well communicated in that area. It might be a cultural issue. There might even be fear of retaliation on whistleblower side. So there's certainly something to look into. And in this case, the data gives you the anomaly, but then you definitely need to dig deeper into interpret the data. So this is an example where you need to then talk to local management, investigate, try to find out what the reason is, and then try to improve things. I guess in other areas like financial transactions, where it's all more structured, more rule-based, you can work with more automated rules, but that's probably something that Raz and Trevor will go into more detail.
Super, thank you. And Raz, I know you wanted to take us through this slide. Hopefully it will come up in a second. There we go.
Oh, great, thank you. Yes, I think this is a really, I like this slide a lot because, well, I can talk about it for days and end. I won't today, but it really describes the compliance teams and even beyond compliance teams. Sometimes you're dealing with just, you know, Trevor and I work on a lot of investigations, and it's almost exactly the same thing, where what it's trying to demonstrate is that, you know, there are two axes here, and the complexity axis going up is really trying to say the more complex the data becomes, and the more complex the type of analytical techniques you apply. The bottom axis tells you about the business value or the return on investment of using technology, different data, etc. And I think what we try to describe on this chart is everybody, especially in compliance teams, wants to be in that top right-hand corner using advanced analytics, statistical ways, predictive analytics and AI, as we talk about it, to predict things, to put, you know, before they go wrong. I want to know about it. But actually, the journey starts at the bottom left, because to get there is a journey and it takes time. And really, what we see so often where compliance teams sometimes fail is that they think that they can jump to that, you know, the top right-hand side and go and employ certain, I don't know, data scientists or certain skills into the team. And they realize, oh my God, there's lots of things that we haven't even done. We haven't got our data ready. We haven't learned our data or learned the data in our organization well enough to use it for compliance purposes. So often you actually, this is about really to identify these issues and controls, is about looking at the data you've got and then thinking about which type of techniques are going to help me test. We talked a lot around finding the risks, finding the data. Once you've done that, there are different types of testing that you can use to do what you want. Moritz talked about rules-based testing, which is kind of one of the most simple ways, things like looking at round sum amounts and looking at invoices posted on weekends and so on, but they tend to generate a lot of, well, you know, we talk about false positives, they tend to generate a lot of hits. But a lot of those tend to be, well, there's no problem having something posted on a weekend in Dubai because they actually work on a Sunday. We got the weekend wrong in our testing, or simple examples like that. So, but you have to start there because that helps you learn the testing, helps you learn your data. And then you start building things like risk scoring models to the test that you're doing, because some tests you'll do, they might not add so much value compared to other tests. A round sum might be a 1 out of 10, whereas, or the weekend example we used, we could say, well, in Dubai, if we have something posted on a Sunday, it's a 0 out of 10. It doesn't really add much value because they work on a Sunday. Whereas if that happened in England, well, maybe that's a bit weird for somebody in the accounts team to be working on a weekend. There might be some people on this call laughing and saying, I work on the weekends. But in any case, that would raise some alarms. And there are so many other techniques. We use social network analysis that hopefully I can talk about a little bit more later on, around trying to build networks and understanding who's engaging with who, who's interacting with who. And that really helps in the context of things like when you're thinking about bribery and looking at an organization's employee workforce and their interactions with third parties outside the organization. Do you really know who your employees are interacting with? So you build these social, what we call social networks, and overlay that with your testing and data, and you get massive, massive insights, faster insights to the conclusions and the risks that you're trying to measure. But many other aspects there. Last one I'll talk about is, and we heard it a couple of times, around dashboards. So the concept of visualizing data is become more and more prevalent. Everybody is using it more, but there's some dangers there as well. And I think we'll talk about dashboards, but visualizing data, because we have so much of it, can actually really help compliance teams and compliance officers to work out what's going on. You can spot things sometimes a lot faster.
Thanks, Raz. I think that's quite, I mean, some people might already have gone on this entire journey. I'm sure it's quite aspirational for some, but hopefully it's inspiring at the same time. And that actually does move us quite nicely onto dashboards. So thank you, Raz. Moritz, so, you know, obviously dashboards are very, very helpful in order to monitor what's going on, to monitor your program in general. But there are also, as Raz just alluded to, some pitfalls. So how do you still really find the needle in the haystack when you're using dashboards?
Yeah, I mean, obviously we're all big fans of dashboards, right? We're all in the business of digitizing compliance, and dashboards are great and nice to look at. And they provide you a great global overview of your global organization and high-level overview. I think what you should never leave aside and forget looking at dashboards is that you don't lose the connection like to the regular workforce, and not get caught up in your KPIs and in your charts that might give you the impression that everything is running smoothly, but they might also lull you into a false sense of security. So you should always still engage with employees. You should try to understand new business models. You should sit down, talk to people, try to understand what their daily struggle is with compliance and ethics, pitfalls or dilemma questions, to make sure you don't lose that connection, and also identify other risks that you might not currently cover with your dashboards because they are not part of your models or part of your data analysis. So don't lose that connection, even though you have the great dashboard. So I guess you need both. You need the dashboards to really keep a good high-level global overview, but you should always engage also on a bilateral level with employees and with the workforce to stay on top of things.
Thank you. And then when we think about compliance teams and the use of data, and obviously dashboards and other things, what people are usually wanting to do is, as well as just monitor the compliance program, is predict the future to a certain extent. Trevor, do you have thoughts, or have you seen this done practically well? Oh, you're on mute.
I'm going to have to stop that. Sorry. So yes, compliance teams have many data points that are available to them, and some of spotting trends is actually just using some of those data points. For example, trying to identify cultural hotspots within the organizations, areas of the business where perhaps the culture isn't where you want to be. So you might pull together different data points, such as an increased rate of whistleblowing reports, worsening employee engagement scores, bringing in from HR details of staff turnover. Is staff turnover very high? So if you start getting a number of these data points going in an adverse direction, it will help compliance to determine, well, maybe we need to go in there and see if there's something systematic, some underlying problem that is causing these data points to change. And another example is your investigation findings. You're using your investigation findings to identify control weaknesses within your organization, but also to influence your training programs to ensure the same flaws don't occur in other parts of the business.
And Raz, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's definitely possible to use data to help predict and prevent things going wrong. There's no doubt. But what I will say is it's quite difficult. You know, for various reasons we've talked about, having the data sets, linking them, having the right infrastructure, people who can apply these advanced analytic techniques. You know, we mentioned artificial intelligence. But yes, it's definitely possible. I mean, I can talk about some examples, perhaps. If I mentioned social network analysis, so building networks based on information that you can gather, whether within the organization or outside, to link. You know, again, I think about bribery and corruption. We've worked on engagements where we're focused on interactions with politically exposed people, so government officials. And how do you do that? And you know, it's sometimes quite often to detect that type of information, or even have that type of information. And you have to start building these networks to understand that. And that's where you can get your supplier information. And if you can combine that with things, you know, again, supplier information tends to sit somewhere in the organization, which might be somewhere different to your onboarding and KYC data, where you may have those organizational structures. Who are the owners of these suppliers? What company structures are set up? What are the shareholdings? And so the information related to a potential government official may exist somewhere else compared to your supplier data. But if you can bring that data together and build those social networks, that's when you can really start understanding, well, can I predict something that's going wrong? You know, transactions that are being alerted that might be related to government officials. If you have the insights, you can do that. There's some really good examples of organizations, and we talked about some of the financial institutions. There are some financial institutions I've worked with where they're using social networks that I just talked about, but they're using things like Facebook, Twitter feeds, etc., to build these social networks, and really trying to look at their customer base and link those to things like terrorist financing. And it sounds like, wow, this sounds like something like a TV program, but this is exactly what they do, because they I may be a customer at a particular bank, and I'm not on let's say a sanctions list or any kind of terrorist financing list or something like that. But if they can build a social network of me, and I've got a cousin who's taking pictures, posting pictures on Twitter and sending those to me around, let's say, related to ISIS or a terrorist organization, that's something that financial institutions are putting a little red flag against me, saying, well, he's not on a list, but I might want to look a little bit more carefully around the transactions that RAS, my customer, is performing. So really, it sounds quite far-fetched, but that's exactly the kind of thing that artificial intelligence can help with.
That's really interesting. And I mean, as I said at the beginning, we can't have a conversation about technology without AI. So Raz, thanks for those examples. Trevor, do you have any other thoughts on how AI is applied?
I think for me, actually, one of the key points when you use AI is ensuring you as a company understand what it's doing for you, what is under the bonnet of the AI. If you have to face up to a regulator to explain your compliance program and you can't answer the question as to why the tool or technique such as AI is suitable to measure the specific risk you're trying to, or if you can't articulate its limitations and why those limitations are acceptable, I think your relationships with regulators are going to start to become problematic.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I mean, it's such a buzzword, but then equally, I think implementing AI is extremely challenging in itself. And as Raz went through the journey earlier, you've got to be quite far along the journey to be in that position. And that takes us quite nicely, I think, onto what the future of compliance could look like. I mean, the question always comes up, will AI be taking over humans? So I'd be interested in your thoughts. Moritz, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, you're right. This question always comes up when we talk about compliance and digitization and AI. Will the robot do my job in the future? I think the short answer is no, because we've heard from Christian Hunt this morning compliance is not black and white, or at least it's not enough anymore today to only look at legal compliance. We have to look at ethics, at values. And there's a lot of gray area where it's already difficult for humans to make the right call, and we don't always get it right. So it's really difficult for AI or robots at this point to get it right. So all of the basically decision making, rule setting, I think that's still a very human process. And it will not be replaced by robots anytime soon. I think what we will see more and more is basically also alongside the journey that Ras showed, we'll see more robotic process automation where humans define the rules and then robots help us getting processes streamlined and getting data analyzed. And then at some point we will see more AI also in the compliance program with software uncovering new patterns that we might pay attention to. But I don't see AI or robots taking over the compliance and ethics function anytime soon.
Fair enough. And Trevor, do you have any other thoughts on that?
Yes, I agree with Moritz. He's right that it won't take over. And I think what the beauty of AI can be for compliance professionals is it will hopefully take away a lot of the mundane tasks. It will make some of the tasks 100% instead of sampling. And I think there'll be a lot of interest from compliance professionals in helping get AI right and working for them so that they can take the decisions and using their brain power in the way they most want to use it. And if I can just go back to the regulators again, you know, they are encouraging greater use of technology. So you'll have seen that the US Department of Justice in some of its DPA language is starting to ask questions around how companies integrate data analytics into their compliance programs. Do compliance teams have access to the right data? Is AI or data analytics being used to monitor risks and test policies and procedures? And I think companies who use AI and who use technology can use that to demonstrate to regulators that they are engaged in continuous compliance improvements.
Thanks. And we've spoken a lot about, I suppose, technology being used well. Do you see compliance teams that use technology, but maybe not to its full potential? Raz, do you want to take us through that?
Sure. I think, thank you for sharing that. This is a nice diagram that kind of depicts this concept of continuous compliance monitoring. I think what tends to happen often is that, you know, I see data and analytics, they are used by compliance a lot of times, but it's used in a very piecemeal or ad hoc basis. And it's not really built into that future planning aspect. And so what you can do is, if you do have that vision that we talked about, you embark on that journey. We talked about engaging with the stakeholders, and really it's not about engaging with the stakeholders for the sake of it. It's because you will need them throughout that journey. And there's some of them are listed here at the bottom of this screen. But then you build these what we call automated data feeds, so that it's not just a one-off exercise, because the one-off exercise is costly. It can take time, it can take a lot of resources. But when you do the things that we've described here, you know, having various data sources where the data sits in, and actually building automated data feeds, then you're building tests, and often the tests first time round are not very productive. But you have to review those tests. You have to look at those rules, look at the alerts. And I think one of the key things that often comes up again, and I use the word ad hoc, or it's like in an investigation, you know, sometimes things come up, an investigation happens, you find out, you quantify, you report, and that's it. And that's such a big mistake that I see happen time and time again. In that after we've done an investigation, something's come up from a compliance test or whatever it might be, it's that feedback loop that's missing. It's improving the process again for next time. And that's where, you know, we talked a little bit around around AI. I'll talk about machine learning, which is an aspect of AI. and how that's very much used for that kind of loop back process where, again, financial institutions are very good at using machine learning in where there's thousands, well, I should say millions of transactions being processed every day. Hundreds of thousands of those may come up with alerts. And there's a real direct cost to compliance teams because they now have reviewers sitting and having to review these transactions that have been alerted because of the tests. But where some organizations are using AI is using machine learning to see that, well, a reviewer keeps saying, I don't know, they see the word Cuba in a company that's Scuba Diving Limited, and it keeps coming up with an alert because there's a test for it, a sanctions related test or something like that. But what the machine can do is learn that that keeps getting set off as a false positive, that keeps going off as a false positive. Now, there are some techniques where you can go unsupervised. As soon as that happens so many times, it starts becoming the norm and the machine takes over. But to Trevor and Moritz's point is you can't come away from that human factor. And I think that's where the human intervention, human supervision comes in to kind of say, well, we've got to review these things that are popping up. The machine learning is telling us that these are perhaps something that we can save and optimize our alert generation. And that's where the human can drive the rules better in the testing and actually improve it. So this concept of continuous monitoring is, yes, you can monitor large data sets, you can build tests and so on, but it's really important to not come away from that human supervision and intervention to improve things and optimize things.
Great, and actually, as a final question that we'll deal with before we see if there are other questions, I think we've actually answered a couple of the questions that have come in as we've gone through. But you've already mentioned stakeholders in this slide. But in terms of actually implementing technology, often you would need to get other stakeholders involved in order to get their support, etc. And I think we spoke before when we were preparing for this session, saying that sometimes when you're implementing something, initially it benefits compliance, but actually then you realize, or then other teams realize that they can also benefit from these technology solutions. So it'd be great to get some examples of where that's happened. Moritz, I think you had some thoughts.
Well, a really simple example, maybe one of the software solutions that we offer is a policy management solution. And for that to really target the policies to exactly the right employees, you need proper employee data. And that's where for many SMEs, the journey basically starts and they realize we don't even have proper employee data in place. It's not even available or it's pretty outdated. We don't have the right information we need to really target policies and then get the feedback from employees. So the digitization journey basically starts one step prior to implementing a policy management system. It starts with getting proper employee data. And that then, of course, benefits the whole organization because qualitative employee data you need for many different other use cases as well, like training, performance review, and so on, basically the whole organization. So that's an example of how implementing a compliance process or the need to implement a compliance process helps digitizing other parts of the organization as well and getting that data available.
And Raz, I think you've seen examples too.
Yes, I can draw on similar examples where I worked on an engagement a few years ago where we helped a global organization to embed data and analytics into their compliance monitoring program. And it was very much starting off with that, you know, a compliance lens. So we're trying to detect and prevent issues, remediate them, maybe by updating policies and informing screening and so on. But very, very soon you realize that the data that you need to embed analytics into compliance, the data that you're collecting and kind of, again, going through those processes of preparing that data for analysis, cleaning that data and getting it ready for testing is the same kind of data that many other functions within the organization needed to help them with their jobs. So for example, once we started working with the business and actually putting what we called a business lens on that same data, they were able, you know, finance teams were able to, we helped them identify cost reductions. Nothing to do with compliance at all, but it's because we had that access to clean data that we were using for compliance purposes, we could actually use those to help finance pick the right suppliers because they were cheaper or so on. I remember working with their tax teams and making that organization save, millions of pounds of tax, of overpayment of tax, just because they hadn't had access to the right data. Again, operational efficiencies, massive operational efficiencies you can get, but it all goes back to having the support of these other functions early on. And I think the nice thing in that particular story I have is, we started with that compliance lens, but knowing that we needed finance, knowing that we needed IT, knowing that we needed legal and other teams to support this process, they were engaged early on. And they actually saw the fruits of the work maybe quite a while later. But that was the really, for me, it was really, very, very good storyline, because you start with the compliance lens and you're actually helping the organization as a whole. So really nice. And yeah, it does work.
It's interesting because across the three webinars in this series, there's been a lot around making friends, essentially making friends with other departments and seeing how you can work together from many different lenses. And I think this is just another great example of where that can be useful. And obviously you make friends by helping people as well. So I think that's a really nice example. And just moving on to the Q&A, I think this comes back to something, to what you mentioned, Raz, earlier in terms of social network analysis. There's a question that's come through from the audience about the fact that aren't there privacy implications for doing social network analysis?
There are. That's a very, very challenging area for organizations. There are. What if I use a good example of, if you look at what's happening in the Netherlands, for example, and the Nordics are actually doing this, there is a number of financial institutions that do their own testing, but they've built these central organizations where they can, in an encrypted fashion, send the monitoring and testing that's coming out of their individual financial institutions. So the transaction monitoring they're doing, there are hits coming out for certain customers. And they're in an encrypted fashion sharing that information with each other so that the central organization can connect the dots and build social networks and see those kind of things. There certainly are certain jurisdictions that you cannot get data out of, full stop. You cannot do that kind of thing. There are personal, like you mentioned, personally, this is not about hacking people's personal accounts and trying to steal anything. It's all, when I mentioned financial institutions doing this, it's all done with the measures without breaking any data privacy laws. And those are challenging things. We talk around sharing of information between the private and public sector a lot. And there are certain challenges, and certain jurisdictions do it better than others. So those challenges are there, but there's definitely opportunities for that to work.
Thank you. And I'm conscious of time. I'd like to wrap up fairly shortly, but as much as I said at the beginning, we can't get through this without talking about AI, which I think is a very important topic. As much as I wanted to avoid the topic of COVID, I am going to bring it up. And just, if we're talking about technology, there's been a lot of talk about the fact that this has really accelerated companies' transition into using technology solutions because they've had to, with people working remotely, etc. What have you seen the implications, I guess, for your clients, and whether you've actually seen that acceleration in practice? I don't know who wants to take this. You can probably raise your hand because I can see you. So whoever does. Trevor, do you want to start?
I can make a start. I think there's some benefits and negatives probably with all of this. COVID implications. People are more accessible now. People are getting much more familiar with Zoom, WebEx, Team Meets, and others. And certainly from, I've got much more used to using it, and I will get questions fired at me from a team using Zoom chat or whatever, perhaps in a more frequent, a greater frequency than I used to. And I think for compliance teams, that probably gave them greater interaction with the business than perhaps they used to, because people are used to these platforms. But I know there's also the thought that, now that the compliance risks will change as a result of people working from home. So there needs to be a reassessment of that. And how much monitoring and technology do you put in place to monitor your employees? Because there's obviously there's a trust element between employees and their their compliance team as well. So you have to get the balance right, and I think that's what compliance teams are probably or should be grappling with at the moment.
But Raz, did you want to add a few words?
Yeah, I'll take another angle of it. We actually did a lot of research and work with some organizations in the early weeks of this, COVID and lockdown and so on, and recognizing a lot of some of the organizations that already had monitoring capability built in. So we talk about testing transactions, etc. These some of those more sophisticated ones had already got models built in. So their transaction monitoring might have said, well, this particular customer profile tends to walk into the bank and do their activity. Fast forward to lockdown, people are doing everything online, and suddenly their alerts that were being raised were much more because things are now happening not in the norm, but something different. And so they had to adjust these, they had to recalibrate, I should say, their testing so that it did, because of what was happening. And then the other interesting thing, we hear a lot about the new normal, what that means and so on. Often, again, when I think about transaction monitoring, we use historic data to help us understand what's going on, to then build tests to pick things that are outliers, things that are not the normal. But this period of time in history will always impact those models for the future, because these models that we build in the future that are going to pick up these, red alerts and so on, always have to look at this period of time almost as an anomaly. And it can't just say historic data going back 10 years. You almost have to, well, however long this is going to last, you almost have to deal with this period as an anomaly and adjust those models again, so that you're not either generating too many alerts or almost missing alerts because of the data that's being generated. So some really fascinating things that compliance teams have to work really carefully around, and make those adjustments. And the last thing I'll add to that, to what Trevor had, talked about earlier, is when you do make those adjustments, it's so key to understand the impact of those adjustments and be transparent with your regulators about those, why you're making those decisions, why they're fit for purpose, why they continue to measure the risks, so that A, you can explain them, and B, if there is a situation where you need to explain them to the regulator because of something gone wrong, you can justify why you've done that. That's just, we've seen time and time again, regulators working with clients and seeing, and prosecutors, I should say, seeing that they've embedded technology, they understand what they've done, and there's leniency in an investigation to see that they've tried, they understood what they were doing, they really did think that's the best thing to do. It just didn't work as well as it should have done, compared to those that didn't.
Great, thank you. Now, I think we have 3 minutes left. So I would like, if you can, each of you just to take the main thing, one main thing, just very briefly, that you'd like people to take away with them following this. Moritz, do you want to start?
Yeah. So I think the key takeaway, even as we've seen that AI will probably not replace the compliance and ethics function, I think it's really important for compliance and ethics professionals to be informed about new technology, to investigate new technology, to try to understand what new technology does, like AI, like blockchain, because on the one hand, it might be beneficial for their own purposes, for their own processes, but on the other hand, it might also be a compliance risk. For example, we've seen, I think a couple of years ago at Uber, there was this guard view where basically every employee was able to see which user is using which Uber to go where, which is of course a very ethical, questionable process. But if you're not aware of this process and this technical possibility as a compliance and ethics professional, of course you're not aware and you can't do anything about it. So you should be knowledgeable about these things, try to be up to date on this technology, because it might be beneficial for you, but it also might be a new compliance or ethics risk for the organization.
Great, thank you. And I'm afraid I'm going to have to cut both of you relatively short, so in 20 seconds or less. Trevor.
So I would say focus on the issue you want to solve rather than the technology you want to use. And remember, basic analytics with good data will give you a better result than advanced analytics with poor data.
Brilliant, thank you. And Raz? Same.
I'll focus on having a strategy of how you're going to use technology and data and getting that early and continued buy-in from the stakeholders that will help.